All right, welcome to the biology notes over section 5 of chapter 12. This section is on the radiation of multicellular life. Now, if you remember, we think that life originated, that the original living things would have been prokaryotes, and that those prokaryotes would evolve into eukaryotes. Seeing as eukaryotes are more complicated than prokaryotes, this makes logical sense. And then once you have eukaryotes, then you could have multicellular life. So it's just the next step up. It's a little bit more complicated, right? So this transition from eukaryotes into multicellular organisms, all those living things that you know and love, all those organisms, all those living things that you can actually see without a microscope, we're keeping track of those things, and they mark the beginning of the Paleozoic era. Right? Before this time, in what we call the Precambrian time, all that existed were those single-celled organisms, and life was pretty boring. But once we hit this Cambrian explosion at the beginning of the Paleozoic, that's when all the major animal groups that exist today evolved. And it only took a few million years for that to happen. I know that sounds like a really long period of time, but it's actually very short as far as the history of the Earth is concerned. So all the bacteria and things we talked about before, that was all Precambrian. Now we're going to talk about after that Cambrian explosion, and we're going to summarize those key events in the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic eras. But the other objective is also to identify how changes in the environmental conditions would have affected the evolution and radiation of animal groups. So we're going to go ahead and start here with Paleozoic. Paleozoic was that first era that we need to deal with. Paleo actually means ancient. So when you're trying to remember which of the three you're talking about, this one's the oldest. The beginning of the Paleozoic was marked by the Cambrian explosion. You have a huge diversity of animal species that are going to evolve at this time. Right? Again, it was within a few million years, which is a relatively short period of time in terms of evolution. But after this time, life gets a little bit more interesting. So we're going to start keeping track a little bit more closely. Early on, all of the life would be found in the ocean. Right? That's where we figured all the ingredients were to make those initial cells for that first living thing. So it makes sense that the first multicellular life would also show up in the ocean, eventually making its way to land. All right. So there are many periods that make up the Paleozoic era, but there's only one that we really focus on a lot, and that's because it's kind of important to us today. Organisms that died and were buried in sediment during the Carboniferous period are the main source of the fossil fuels that we use today. Right? So the oil, the coal, all those things that we use to power our everyday life, all those things that we use to make plastics, like what this computer is made of, and the power to give it the power to actually do what we're doing with it right now, to watch this video. So fossil fuels are pretty important to us. We need to understand that they are non-renewable, that fuel is a non-renewable resource, because it took 500 million years for that stuff to turn into fossil fuels, for that dead, decaying organic material to turn into that fuel that we use today. So we don't really have time to wait for more of it to be formed. We're using it faster than it can replace itself. So it's non-renewable, and we need to deal with that. We need to find other sources of energy. Right? We need to find ways to recycle the materials that we already have to make new stuff. Because we're running out of those fossil fuels, and it might not happen in your lifetime, but at some point we're going to have to deal with that. Okay, so after the Paleozoic comes the Mesozoic. Remember, meso means middle, so when you're trying to keep track, this is the one that's in between. Paleo is the oldest, Cenozoic is actually the newest, and this one's in between. I think I've already referred to the Mesozoic as the age of the reptiles. Remember, that means that's when those dinosaurs were roaming the earth. There are some other notables that radiated at this time. Right? There were birds and flowering plants. Right? Seems kind of small, but before this time there were no flowers, and after this time there were flowers. So that actually is a pretty big deal. Right? Got lots of color showing up that wasn't there before. Also, we have mammals that came about at this time, but they weren't really mammals like you and me. Mostly the biggest group to radiate at this time for the mammals were the marsupials. Remember, marsupials are those mammals that have pouches that they carry their young in. They're those ones that we find in Australia, like kangaroos. So they're actually kind of weird and rare today, but they were actually the most prevalent mammals in the beginning. So again, it's the age of the reptiles. You had dinosaurs all over the place. You also had birds coming from reptiles, we think. So in terms of evolution, the reptiles came first, and the birds came from them. They're descendants of those reptiles. You got flowering plants, which again was a new thing. And you have mammals, but mostly those weird mammals, or at least what we would consider weird, because they're not quite like us yet. At the end of the Mesozoic, there was a mass extinction that killed off all the dinosaurs, and we believe that it was caused, moving the words instead of the box again. We believe that it was caused by the impact of a large asteroid. The debris from that huge impact would have blocked out sunlight, and it would have been bad enough. There would have been enough debris that it would have caused some climate change, so it would have gotten cold. And also, it would have caused a reduction in photosynthesis. Understand, without sunlight, plants can't do their thing and make all that food for animals to live off of. Most dinosaurs being herbivores, there's only a few that were actually carnivores. So both things were bad. Reptiles don't like cold because they're not warm-blooded like we are. They can't hold heat in to keep themselves warm. They need that warmth from their environment. Plus, they lost a lot of food in the process. So a combination of things is what led to those dinosaurs dying out. But remember, what was bad for them was good for us. That mass extinction just opened the door for mammals to evolve. It opened the door for mammals to radiate into all the different species that we know today. So just like the end of any era, any period, there was a mass extinction, this one being notable because it mattered to us. Without it, we couldn't exist. Okay, so after the Mesozoic, we have the Cenozoic. Ceno means new. So this is the most current, this is the newest, this is now, right? We are currently in the Cenozoic as we speak. During this time, some of the major things to evolve and diversify were mammals, placental mammals, and also monotremes. So that's a little bit different. Monotremes, if you don't remember, are the mammals that actually lay eggs. So they're very weird compared to most of the mammals that you're used to. But those placental mammals are the ones that show the most dramatic radiation. Most of what we see today are those placental mammals. You also have radiation of birds, ray-finned fish, flowering plants, but probably the most important for us is our earliest ancestors would have arisen around the end of the tertiary period. Modern humans have only been around for 200,000 years in reality, but our earliest ancestors would have come before then, right? So we're obviously going to evolve in this time too, since we are still here and we're still in that era. But our earliest modern ancestors were around 200,000 years ago, but that doesn't mean that we didn't have ancestors that came much, much earlier than that. So again, Cenozoic, dominated by mammals. Placentals were the ones that won out overall. So we were adapted a little bit better. Didn't have the eggs to deal with. No pouches anymore, right? Placental mammals are basically any mammal that you can think of that's not a kangaroo, that's not in Australia. So they're the most predominant animal at this time, land animal, and that brings us up to date because modern humans have been around for 200,000 years. We're still in the Cenozoic. So that's it for these notes.